Welcome to the Teaching Change podcast, where we explore issues of social entrepreneurship, education, and innovation. I'm your host, Jerrid Kalakay.
On today's show, we're talking with Rachel Christensen of the University of San Diego. Rachel, welcome to Teaching Change.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Rachel, I would love for you to kind of start out by talking a little bit about, introduce yourself, and then talk a little bit about your work. You've done a bunch of stuff, a bunch of things, and now you're working in higher education, still doing a bunch of things. So why don't you share just kind of who you are and what you're doing currently, and then we'll kind of dive off from there.
Sure. So my name is Rachel. I'm based in San Diego. Relevant a little bit for what we'll talk about today is probably two things. So my context is the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. We're about 15 minutes from Tijuana, Mexico, and that's part of our pedagogy and how we interpret our context for the social innovation work that we do. The other piece that's relevant to today is that I run our Center for Peace and Commerce, which is a center that's a partnership, I think, in a pretty cool and radical way between a School of Business and a School of Peace and Justice. So the idea is we're trying to bring together sometimes disparate worlds and paradigms around change. Some of them that believe in business models, and some of them that believe in negotiation and community organizing, and realizing that we're going to need all approaches for us to make sustainable social change. And what that looks like on an operational level is I help primarily students from University of San Diego and our partner institutions around the world from about 12 countries to try their hands at building a social enterprise. So we kind of culminate a lot of our activities in a global social venture pitch competition that's oriented around the Sustainable Development Goals and really has as primary goals learning and connecting around the Sustainable Development Goals, and as a secondary goal generating some ideas that could be sustainable social enterprises.
Wow. So that's a lot of stuff.
Already. It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. What I think is really neat is talk a little bit more about your School of Peace and Justice and the School of Business coming together in the university to create the center that you work in. How unique is that in the landscape of higher education in the United States? And how did that come about?
Yeah, it's very unique. There are so just having a School of Peace or a School of Peace Studies is very rare. Usually to be normative like that, usually it's war and conflict and peace or something like that. So to study explicitly in the direction of peace is rare in itself. There's only a couple schools. And then to have a partnership between a business school and a peace school is uncommon in higher ed. However, pretty not necessarily emerging, because it's been going on definitely conversations much longer than this, but since the 70s, there's been scholarship around economic development and peace, commerce through peace through commerce initiatives. And in the peacemaking space, economic generating activities are deemed as essential. And the conversation, of course, around what's business for has shifted, has either shifted or, depending on who you ask, gone back to the basics of assuming that business should be pro peace and that business could be pro poor. And so those conversations are fairly common, but the actual institutionalization of two schools coming together from sometimes very different paradigms, fairly rare. And how did it come about? Yeah, briefly, how did it come about? It's the center's been around since 2011. Some visionary leaders from University of San Diego definitely recognize the need to reach across the aisle sometimes, and sometimes it requires also retraining our brains as staff, faculty, students, community stakeholders of how we think about change and how it happens.
Mm. And approximately how many people are involved in the center's work? I know the two schools are probably pretty large, and then they've kind of come together with the center. But how many people kind of are involved with the center's operations and the work that you all do?
Yeah, so it's intentionally involving on the doing side, on the implementing side, all of the stakeholders. So we have a team of part-time faculty who have teaching roles, but also advise the center. And then we have two staff, myself and another person, and then student staff part-time who are learning and in class and also work for the center. So that involves sort of the three main stakeholders at the university level: staff, faculty, and students. In terms of participation, however, we work with dozens of faculty, helping them learn how to embed SDGs into their syllabus, learning how to embed experiential learning opportunities into their coursework. And then we have students participate at the University of San Diego from the undergraduate and graduate and PhD levels. And then, as mentioned, we have about 26 university partners per year that come from about 12 countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe, Australia. I don't think I mentioned North America, US and Canada. And so those would be at participation level. We have hundreds of students across those universities.
Wow. That's incredible. And just as a reminder, the university has what's the enrollment at the university?
Yeah, we're around 10,000 undergrad and grad. Yeah, so it's a fairly small university. It's an engaged Catholic university that is contemporary and interfaith in much of the work, but tries to teach Catholic social values in the sense of care for home and dignity of work and some of those values that we bring to what we do. But it's a fairly small private university.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful campus. I was on your campus a number of years ago for the Ashoka Exchange, and it's absolutely gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So, Rachel, how did you come to this work? It sounds like it kind of sounds a little bit exhausting. I'm sure some of my listeners are listening and going, "Wow, that's a lot of stuff." Managing, balancing two complete schools. Bringing them together, and then you've got students in the mix, and you've got international students and faculty. It sounds like an awful lot of stuff that you're kind of balancing. I know you're not doing it alone, but how did you come to this work?
Well, listeners might also be like my grandparents and wish that I would speak more slowly. So some of it could be a function of my my pace of talking. So yeah, the answer is really easy. Maybe two parts. One is that I do consider it bridge work, because you must, I keep saying, bridging worldviews and bridging disciplines. I think that's, I've always found myself doing some kind of bridge work. Prior to this, I was doing, first in field operations role. I was based in the Caribbean, specifically in Santo Domingo, and then would liaise with an office based in the US. And then I flipped and was based in an office in the US and would liaise with primarily Latin American teams. So I think that was bridge work. And I think if I went back any job I've had prior, and a lot of that has to do with how much of my education formation happened here at the at an international border. So I think that the bridge work is one piece of just like we find ourselves sometimes doing similar roles across organizations. And then the other piece is probably the social entrepreneurship piece, which I don't think maybe some of the students that are in school now could have gotten a degree saying, I'm going to be a social entrepreneur. When I was in school, I didn't think that was a path. So I'll definitely admit that I tripped into social entrepreneurship, only really discovering it as a field after graduation. And so I came to it through doing work that was business training and acceleration services for small businesses in the education space. And then over time realized that there was a whole space and then maybe became more interested over time of like new models that could be social enterprise or could be more broadly in the social innovation space. So like most things, I think just like who you are, the bridge piece, and then stumbling into things and then realizing that it's a good place to act out those commitments in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And are you originally from San Diego?
Actually, I was I am from California, but I was raised much of my elementary years in New Jersey, right on the line to New York. So I think a lot of those early years were actually East Coast. Yeah.
Gotcha. I was just so that might be why you speak so quickly.
And walk fast. Yeah.
Yeah. The northeast folks in the U.S. tend to move quick. I'm originally from Connecticut, so I know. The reason why I asked you that question is I was wondering how much of your work and kind of yourself is influenced by being so close to an international border, with Tijuana being right across and all the issues that come along with that, especially in today's world where there's a lot of issues going on around borders in the U.S. and many other countries.
Very, very influenced. Part of that's because of who my teachers were. So I went to school at another university, but also here in San Diego. And, I sort of outed myself actually at a talk I did about a year ago, where I admitted to the fact that I missed lots of birthday parties, final exams, classes, etc. during my undergraduate because I was spending all my time in Tijuana, and specifically spending all my time in the border wait to come back. And so when I started sharing that story, which is just more just youthful boldness or something, I don't know, just thinking I was going to take control of my own education, were maybe two things. One is that I realized that I was receiving my education primarily, and I wouldn't even say just in Tijuana, I was receiving my education in the crossing, in the in-between, partially because of the actual wait time to get back to the US. Back when I was crossing, some of that was the height of that was in 2008, 2010, which actually was when most people from San Diego stopped going to Tijuana because of various geopolitical things and things that had to do with some cartels in conflict. And so a lot of the stuff that I learned there was influenced by that time, and by so anyway, that in between, and then learning how to kind of integrate ways of being from two sides was probably the most formative thing of my life. And I kind of got it showed the board in a sort of way, not trying to be poetic, but just trying to be honest. I think the border sort of chose me. It wasn't something that I chose as an area of academic study or a location for friendships. It just happened. So to make all that more explicit for the pedagogy, I mean, that was how I was taught about a lot of things when I was studying Latin. I did a degree in Latin American studies and political administration, was studying Spanish and other things. So it was a natural place for me to study those things. But now when I teach design thinking or social innovation, I try to do it in a bicultural and bilingual and binational context. So we have students that will come up from Tijuana. It's a pretty easy trolley ride or Uber ride or et cetera. And they'll come to our campus often and study, same with faculty. And then I'll take students to Tijuana, and we'll do things that try to equalize power of facilitation and allow everybody to realize that there's regional issues in common and potentially solutions in common. So it's sort of my framework in the water I think we swim in terms of our context. So very formative for me and how I now teach.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that, and I'm really interested to hear a little bit about. So how do you balance and how do you balance the cultures and the sensitivities that need to be balanced when you have students from Tijuana and students from San Diego and everything in between? I mean, how do you do that in the classroom or in the workshop? You mentioned trying to balance and being sensitive to all those things. Like when you're teaching design thinking, what are some things that you do to create that safe space for everyone to be themselves?
I'm guaranteeing you I'm doing it imperfectly first. I think a second thing is design thinking. I was just actually working with some women peacemakers from this network that USD manages called Women Waging Peace, which I think is brilliant. And we were talking, they use design thinking in their daily work. And we were talking about how human-centered design can be used to collectivize people, particularly in the empathy stage. So even if you're not developing sort of solutions or ideating together, which generally comes next, just the collectivization of folks is a valuable first step. And so I think using that stage empathy is critical. I think another thing that's important and something that sometimes in higher ed we do well and sometimes we do for the wrong reasons, but we should continue to do is, acknowledging positionality is important. I am, as a white woman, and lots of the students I bring may be white, but many of the students that if I'm using the example of bringing students to Tijuana, they're often not. They're often from all over the world. And I think most of them take for granted that talent is distributed equally and opportunity is not. So I think some of it is the positionality, some of it's the empathy and the collectivization. And I think some of it's just very practical, how people sit, how people are asked to engage. So circle would be better than, sitting one behind another, having some convention, whether it's raising hands or something else where people can speak. And then I think language. So if we're doing it in Tijuana, we privilege Spanish and then translate back to English. So I think some of it's the language used. And so I've been to quite a few design thinking workshops. One that comes to mind was actually run by MIT, D-Lab, in partnership with some universities in Colombia and a university in the U.S. Called Colorado School of Mines. And they did the whole process with small-scale miners, most of them women, most of them very much at the edge of poverty. And so seeing design thinking used in a room where there's people that traditionally don't have a lot of power, and then people like MIT D-Lab, educators who have a lot of access and power, I think it can be done well, definitely imperfectly, but when you privilege maybe the language that's more comfortable to people, make sure that everybody feels comfortable through the empathy process, maybe elongate that, don't rush it. Sometimes it could take a whole day. It's not like you just do one empathy activity and you're done. And then the ongoing last piece, and then I'll get off the potential soapbox, is like the ongoing relationship piece. And so being able to do this in the US-Mexico borderlands is different because we can keep going back. We can they can come, in many cases, not all cases, can cross to us, and have to acknowledge that they can't always cross to us. But, it's just so much possible to have those sustained relationships when you're 15 minutes away. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's the relationships that cause the meaningful changes.
Yeah.
If it's not just a one semester and it's done type of scenario. And as academics, I think our predecessors have sometimes done the one and done, gone into some communities, did their research, and then left. And so it's really good to hear that you're very mindful of that, building that relationship and realizing that the anything good's going to come out of the relationship, not the other way around. That's really, really exciting. Why do you do what you do? There's a million things you could probably do that would be, I would argue, a lot easier. I've got a whole page of notes of things that you've already been talking about. I'm sure the University of San Diego doesn't pay millions of dollars a year to you. So why do you do what you do?
Yeah, I think that there are those moments when you're doing, again, it's mostly tripping into finding something that worked for my passions, my skill set, my interests. And so accidentally finding myself in spaces and then being able to have that moment of reflection where you realize, where in this case, I realized that it feels good to be able to do bridge work at the institutional level or maybe structural change level, and then do relationship work. To your point earlier, I haven't seen in my life anybody change their mind about anything that wasn't through meeting somebody that was from that group that they formerly didn't understand, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, my main theory of change, I guess, in the world is that you meet somebody and you might change your mind. And so being able to do both the sort of institutional stuff that checks my the boxes I have for strategy, and maybe academic learning, and then the relational pieces that I get to do at the student level, at the institutional level, between universities, and all of that in between work, I guess just checks enough of the boxes for me that I can't really imagine. I can imagine doing different work in terms of content. I can't imagine doing much else that wasn't sort of bringing people and institutions together. I think I would. It wouldn't check enough of my boxes, and I think I would be wandering, looking to get back to it.
Yeah, totally understand that. So here's my $1 million question.
Okay.
Because you're in academia, but you're not a traditional role,
and I'm not faculty.
So
yeah.
And so have you figured out how to explain what you do to your family?
I'm lucky in that my dad, before social entrepreneur was a thing, was a social entrepreneur. And nice. My mom now chairs a board that is looking at sustainable models for housing for adults with autism. And so I would call her a social entrepreneur as well. And my sister runs a social innovation incubator in Boulder, Colorado. So go figure that even though I don't think any of us would have called ourselves social innovators growing up at all, we would have used different words. I think we've all found ourselves in this space. So I'm lucky in that way. If your question's valid, though. Can I explain it to my aunt and uncle? Having a harder time. And so one thing that's helping is there is shifting language, and there's more thought leadership that's kind of making its way out to people like my aunt and uncle, that they are reading about these conversations around new kinds of business and might have heard of a benefit corporation. and understands that like a lot of charity is toxic and we need to like rethink how we try to help people. So I think that the conversations about like how we do the work are not that hard to have. Sometimes people are surprised that a university might pay somebody to do this work because it seems like too abstract. But that is true a lot about people that look at the academy and don't understand what the practical benefit is. But I have less of that problem because I can tell stories of students, and whether or not their venture was like successful, that's not really the point. The point is like, did they learn these skills that's going to help them be an entrepreneur, a change maker, wherever they live? And I can tell those stories, and then they can nod and understand.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I asked that question because it was years before I finally found the language to explain what I was doing in academia to my family. Because I was not the model student, as my listeners will know, in my younger years. But so obviously you're very, very talented in this kind of work and so forth. Many of our listeners may be teaching a class on design thinking or human-centered design or social entrepreneurship of some level or social innovation. But a vast majority of the folks that are probably out there in the U.S. and around the world that are engaged in the academy may have interest in this, but don't know how to get started. And so obviously what you've done and the center and the two schools coming together, that didn't happen overnight, clearly. No. What would you suggest to a faculty, and not by you necessarily, yeah, but you certainly run with it, along with the rest of the folks that work in it. But what advice would you give to a faculty member that wants to learn more or wants to do more with their class, with a class? How do they get involved in it? I mean, do they have to take on the world all at once, or what would you suggest they do?
No, and actually, a colleague and I, both of us are administrators, so we're not faculty, but both have advanced degrees in this space. Are actually teaching a workshop on this, and we're hoping in about a month, and we're hoping to make that actual that same argument to faculty that you don't have to bite off the whole bite to get started. There's so many ways, and so some of the ways that we offer is you can just ask questions. So we're trying to engage actually around the sustainable development goals. One of the ways being to use action-based learning, experiential learning, and maybe social entrepreneurship curriculum and design thinking. But it's all around the sustainable development goals. And students are demanding it. At least our university, we've surveyed it. They want to have, even in their like intro to marketing class, what does this mean for gender equity? You can, and some of it's just how you moderate your questions to be able to like engage people around some social justice issues potentially. So it could be questions. There's so many resources online, and I don't know if there's a possibility to put links here, but I'll mention a couple that are really easy to Google. Absolutely. Really easy to Google. Around the SDGs, Gap Frame is one that you can go and see how different countries and regions are doing around different sustainable development goals. And so you can interact with charts, and that's a great way to start conversation in a class, and could allow somebody who's teaching something around anything in the math department, for example, where you're having to figure out how to display information. That would be a way to engage with this content, but being able to continue to teach your module. But then there's also so many resources, I think, as you know, and you would have more to share too, around design thinking, certainly IDEO, around social entrepreneurship, certainly Acumen come to mind, among others. And, the power of YouTube too. I mean, something as general as storytelling might lead too many results in YouTube. But when I'm preparing for a workshop, I often will try to find content from different areas, coming from different voices. So I often will just kind of look to see what video content's out there. Some of it's very good, but almost all this stuff is open source. And then the last thing I'll say is, if somebody's wanting to get started, you can always start at home. So this very famous book these days, Designing Your Life, is something that any faculty member could start reading and applying to their life. And we've had quite a lot of faculty do that at USD. And then you start having that be an approach, experiments to get more information, a bias towards action, making sure that you start with your own why and understanding what the actual problem is, the defining stage. All those things then become like an approach that you would bring to everything. So those are like some ways that wouldn't require a lot of time or like a year's lead time to just get started and try things. And some things like in this design thinking space, you maybe have to let go of some of the control. Some things will fall on their face and some things will stick. And that's like how you learn with your students, and they'll teach you too.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what keeps you going? Where do you go to recharge? Are there conferences? Are there certain types of books you like to read that keep you motivated? Because I'm sure that there's obviously tough days, like in any job or any profession. There's good days and there's bad days. And so when you have a tough go of it, what do you turn to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think like many folks, friends and family, and I think the piece I'll emphasize there is certainly being, just being seen by people where you don't have to, you can kind of take the mask off that we sometimes put on is a thing. But I think also just conversation partners. I have so many friends who are lawyers or are environmental activists or, work in business and don't have an explicit, some of them social change piece, but they are a social change person. And just having conversations around work, 21st century work. What really, to answer your question, what really helps me recharge sometimes is being, I guess I belong in the academy, maybe being philosophical about these things instead of hyper focusing on the individual challenges or sometimes politics helps me. Just zooming out maybe would be part of the answer. And zooming out also can happen to your suggestion, either in conferences or convenings. I'm lucky that I get to chat with our partner universities from all over the world all the time on Skype, Zoom, WhatsApp, text message, whatever. And so I feel like I'm often in good company because I'm often working with my counterpart at other universities. And that always helps you zoom out, realize a lot of these things are trends, not personal, and we're in it together. And then I think that the big thing for me is this, like, I'm very, I benefit a lot from a lot of folks in San Diego who have tried to make my neighborhood more walkable. So walking my neighborhood, meeting people, consuming in small businesses, a lot of them found it, San Diego has received traditionally lots of refugees and asylum seekers. So there's many businesses, micro businesses, many of them that sell great food and coffee, very close to my house. And to go and see sort of like the power of community and be able to just like sit and enjoy food or coffee across generations and any other boundaries we might have, always recharges me and connects me back to like the whole. So the real answer is probably walking around my neighborhood with no agenda, and trying to turn off the ideas. Just turn off.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Yeah, I had a colleague a number of years ago who got a dog just so that they would be forced to walk and be outdoors. Yeah. So what would you hope 3 years from now? What would you hope the country, the United States, would be dealing with? What do you hope the design thinking and that entire movement, social entrepreneur movement in general, what would you hope things would look like?
Well, I certainly hope that on at the U.S. level that we could magically shift to be able to practice and model or civil dialogue. I think that without having to have agenda for changing anybody's mind, if we could spend more time in conversation with people, that would be both an important step on that design process to thinking about our democracy, but also would be something that would shift a lot of the harmful conversations I think we have. So that would be my hope for my country. In terms of the space of social entrepreneurship and design thinking, the way I see it going, which I think is a promising trend, I just worry the same way I worry about greenwashing or any time there seems to be more more hype in the corporate social responsibility, et cetera, than the actual substance. I hope we put our money where our mouth is in the trend I see happening, which is more of the conversation happening around equity and community. So there's a lot of design thinking firms that are trying to center equity in the conversation. So design thinking as a way to sort of shift power dynamics is a powerful possibility. Again, when centered, just the way that we tried to center humans in the process, centering equity. And then having a lot more case studies around community entrepreneurship and team-based entrepreneurship rather than by an individual or by an outsider. So solutions coming from formerly hidden assets within a group. I think that's where we're going. I think we're moving away from heropreneurship and towards featuring and supporting teams with complementary skills and different backgrounds. So I think it's encouraging, and I would hope that we do that in a way that would change some structural barriers.
Awesome. Well, Rachel, this has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Is there anything else? Is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners before we end?
I guess I would like to share my experiences that I think this is obvious to most of us that are in the education space, but students learn a lot more from who you are than what you say. And I think that that's not to put extra pressure on us because we're not supposed to be perfect, but just to remember that, especially in this space, many of us maybe wouldn't recognize ourselves as social innovators, maybe would embrace the term change maker, but the way that we live and the way that we treat people is probably the best way to teach our students how to be different kinds of leaders and people in the world. So keep doing it.
Till next time, be nice and change some stuff.